Hello, my name's Kevin Partner and I'm the author of the Strike series of comic fantasy novels, and I'd like to read chapter 1 of the third book in the series, Strike Alight. Never outsource the catering to dwarfs, they'll always sell you short. On the twirl, this is a famous saying. Unfortunately for Bill Strike, soon to be bridegroom, he hadn't heard it before. Catering and weddings not being familiar topics. He was a lost traveller in an unfamiliar landscape. On the other hand, his soon-to-be bride hadn't yet found out that he'd entrusted the provision of food and drink for the most important day of her life to Messrs. Lazy, Slipshod and Tardy, purveyors of economical delights for important occasions on a budget. Bill suspected that, had she known this, he would cease to be a bridegroom in waiting and progress speedily and with deadly force to becoming the former fiancé never to be mentioned again. And the wedding was planned for next week. Bill looked down at the economically sized hors d'oeuvre on the not even remotely silver tray and then looked down further at the dwarf holding it. "Aren't you going to try one?" asked the dwarf from somewhere around Bill's knee level. Bill put out his tentative hand and searched for the nibble that looked least obnoxious. It was a challenge, but he eventually found one that seemed to contain something recognisable. "Ah, I see you've selected one of our specialities, fromage de blaireau." With great care, Bill put the small biscuit and its payload into his mouth. He ran his tongue around it before chewing down and swallowing. "Cheese?" he said. "Not bad. It's a bit on the small side, though, isn't it?" The dwarf reddened. "Small? Who are you calling small? I meant the cheese. It's not exactly a mouthful." "Well, what do you expect? It's not easy to milk badgers, you know. They're all hair for one thing, and they're bloody difficult to persuade to sit still while you do it." Bill retched, and the cheese rocketed from his gullet and flew across the kitchen to smack into a wall, where it remained stuck and smoking. The dwarf shook his head. "Waste of a good cheese. That's gourmet, that is." Bill held his breath as he poured water from a jug straight down his throat, which at this point felt as though it was stuck together from the inside. After a few coughs and a few more deep breaths, he felt able to continue. "I'm sure, Mr. Sorry, I didn't catch your name." "That's because you weren't listening when I told you. It's something to do with my height, you see. Words spoken up at people seem to lack authority or importance," the dwarf said sadly. "My name is stubbornly lax, and I am a smelter of niceties." By this point Bill had seated himself at a table in the kitchen of Hemlock's farm and was therefore able to look the dwarf in the eye. "The problem is, Mr. Lax, that I don't think my wife-to-be—" At this point his eyes glazed over. The casual observer might have assumed that he was imagining the carnal delights of the honeymoon night. Anyone who knew Brianna, on the other hand, would know that his mind was actually full of knives and their potential proximity to his wedding equipment. His face hardened. Caught between making a firm of dwarfs unhappy, and by extension all dwarfs in the locality, they were gossipy bastards, and thus risking a cudgel in the dark the next time he was walking the streets of Upper Bottom, and the sure and certain knife in the privates he'd receive if he cocked up the catering, he chose to upset the little people. He could hear her derisive voice echoing in the chambers of his mind. "One job! You said you wanted to be involved in the wedding plans, and so I asked you to sort out the catering. I mean, how hard could it be? One job! That's all you had, and you cocked it up." There was nothing else for it. "I'm sorry, but this just isn't good enough." Bill had never seen a chameleon, but if he had, he'd still have believed it couldn't hold a candle to the speed with which Stubbornly's face went from pink through red to purple. "Not good enough," he erupted. "This is finest dwarfish fare. Do you know how hard it is to convince dwarf chefs to share their finest recipes with you BFGs? You know we have a saying, a little goes a long way, and I bet you've not got the taste of the badger cheese out of your mouth yet, have you?" "Well, that's true enough," Bill replied. He ran his tongue around the inside of his jaw to check for any damage. No teeth had dissolved, but there were a number of suspiciously sticky lumps between them, and his mouth tasted like rancid cider. "So when you look at it that way, we're actually very economical. One badger cheese on a stick, and the guest is not going to want to eat anything else in a hurry." Plucking another lump of steaming detritus from between his teeth, Bill flicked it into the kitchen sink. He found a milking stool and sat on it facing the dwarf. "Look, I'm sure your food is of gourmet standard, but we're catering for a less discerning audience. The dwarf's face brightened. Ah, I see what you mean, he said, scratching his chin thoughtfully. A rural audience, would you say? Oh, definitely. Some of the guests have never even seen a paved road, Bill lied, adding mortar to the brick wall of their shared delusion. So, perhaps something a little simpler would be more appropriate? Bill nodded vigorously. And more capacious? For the same money? Yes, Bill said. His budget had been set by Brianna, and some of it had already been sunk into the several pints of pickled stoat it had taken for him and his father Blackjack to discuss the wedding plans. Stubbornly sucked his teeth and shook his head. That's a challenge and no mistake. More food for less money, is it? That's about the size of it, Bill responded. The dwarf's face tightened as resentment at the use of that particular adjective clashed briefly with the clinking of gold in his customer's pocket. Gold that could be his. Well, I'm afraid there will have to be compromises. Fair enough. We'll have to cut out the badger cheese, spider souffle and owl pellet soup, he said. Bill shook his head in mock disappointment. Well, if there's no budget. But we could probably manage to squeeze a few fox testicles into the cream tea. No, that's okay, really, Bill managed, wincing. Stubbornly shrugged. That's a pity. All we're left with then would be a pig on a spit and lots of cheap ale. Bill relaxed. Sounds perfect. Well, it's your funeral, stubbornly said. Not anymore, thought Bill.